All right, today we will talk about the scientific method. Last time we talked a little bit about the fact that in science, and in psychology is a science, not a pseudoscience, because in psychology we use the scientific method to gain knowledge. We use empirical evidence, which means based on observations, on systematic observations, to develop theories and to discuss cases. So the scientific method has 5 steps, and you will see different variations of this scientific method. Sometimes you see a circle, sometimes you see a little bit different terminology, but that's okay. It all kind of means the same thing. I like this specific 5-step terminology best because I think it explains the scientific method in a very clear way. So how do we make these systematic observations? In science, we usually ask a question, a research question first. So we're interested in something, right? We're curious about something. And the fun part is you will actually in the lab this week develop a research question and turn it into a hypothesis. It's fun stuff. So make sure to pay attention really what the difference is between a research question and a hypothesis. So we're asking a question. Well, I'm curious about something. I'm curious why kids on the playground act a certain way maybe. And I'm going to come up with a question to look into playground behavior. Maybe I'm going to say, hey, I think among preschool children, when a new child enters the playground, I'm curious how it really connects best to other children and starts playing with other children. That's my basic question. So, and then I want to state a hypothesis. That would be the step 2. And the difference between a research question and a hypothesis is I'm already making kind of a prediction of the outcome of my study. And you're like, why? How can I get from the research question to the hypothesis? Well, in research, the step in between is we conduct a literature review. That means, hey, I know other people have researched that question and have researched playground behavior. So I have to go to my library of all scientific journals. And as a student, you have access to the El Camino library system, and you can access scientific journals and articles. And as a researcher, I have databases available with articles on prior research studies. And I want to go to the primary source. We talked about that last time, to these primary source articles. So the actual study articles, to find out more what previous studies have looked at when it comes to playground behavior. And then I read a lot of studies. I try to read as many studies as I can about that topic. And then I come to a hypothesis or a prediction of what will happen in my study based on the research that I read. And, it's, I'm trying to come up with the best prediction based on how I will set up my study, what exactly I will measure, how I will measure how old my kids are, etc. Because when you conduct a literature review, you will find certain studies will come up with certain conclusions or outcomes, and other studies may even be in contradiction to that. And I will learn as a researcher, as a scientist, to critically evaluate these studies, see which one best applies to my specific scenario, and make a hypothesis or state a hypothesis based on that. There's always conflicting amount of evidence, but usually there's a pattern or a trend that is relevant to my study. So again, I ask the question first. I'm curious about something. I formulate a question. The important thing about formulating a research question, I have to ask something that can be tested. I can't ask a question that cannot be tested. Like, is there God? You know, a big belief question or a rumor or about an anecdote, something I can't prove, something I can't test is not a research question. And then again, the difference between a research question and a hypothesis is the hypothesis is already a prediction of the outcome based on previous research, not based on my own personal guesses, but based on evidence, on scientific evidence. That's important. Then the next step would be to conduct my experiment, and we will learn on how to do that in this course. There are a lot of details involved, and you will learn about those, and that's kind of fun and exciting and a big eye-opener for anyone who has not conducted research before. Then after I gathered all my data, I will analyze the results. So that's the statistical analysis. That's also, you had a statistic course as a prerequisite for this course. No worries, I'm not gonna I will review things we need as we need them, but to be able to conduct the correct statistical analysis is important, of course. People can make mistakes here and then you can throw out the results. But as researchers, we learn what statistical analysis is appropriate for our specific study. And then I come to conclusions. So I have my outcome. I have to interpret that still. I have to interpret what that means. And I have to come to a conclusion of what the results from my study really meant. And then really, as a next step, I will go and come up with new ideas of how I can build new studies on the outcomes of this study. So those are the steps of the scientific method. Again, to review, so a research question is really an area of interest, a curiosity, but it has to be testable. And here's some important vocabulary now that you really, this is foundational. You need to know what this highlighted vocabulary is, make flashcards of it. So let's go over it. So my research questions ask about specific variables. So the variables in research are what we call these areas of interest that we examine. So let's do this with some examples. And often in research, we ask two variable questions. This is an illustration of one, and often we can phrase these two variable research questions as the effects of on. And when I phrase my research question as the effects of, which is my of, whatever follows of is my independent variable and on is my dependent variable. That's what I measure. So I'm going into examples on the next slide, but remember this phrase, the effects of, I'll have my independent variable on something is my dependent variable. That's what I measure. The independent variable is what, as the researcher, I can change and manipulate. And the dependent variable is what I measure. So hold on for a second. We're going into examples of these research questions. Let's say the effects of coffee on memory. So from what I just told you, which one is the independent variable? Which one is the dependent variable? Well, I said previously the effects of independent variable. So coffee is my independent variable on memory. Memory is what I will test and measure. So memory will be my dependent variable. And that's very important to distinguish, that you become very fluent to distinguish between those two. And the abbreviation is IV and TV for the class purposes here. So make sure you know the difference. So the effects of coffee on memory. Previously, I said coffee, the independent variable, is what I manipulate as in an experiment. I am able to manipulate it. In other types of studies, I just observe it. But in an experiment, I manipulate it. And you're like, what does that mean? How do I manipulate coffee? Well, think about it. If I really want to test the effects of coffee on memory, and I set up an experiment where I control this independent variable, what I would do is, for example, let's say I will have a group of students and I test them, and I have 200 students. and I will test one group and I give them coffee before the memory test. And the other group, my control group, does not get any coffee before the memory test, and I give both groups the same memory test. So now I can say I manipulated coffee. One group had coffee, one group didn't have coffee. I would probably be a little bit more sophisticated in my research, and I would say, okay, I will have 3 groups. One group will get 100 milligrams of coffee, a little tablet, because I really want to control it and not just rely on them telling me they had a cup of coffee. I don't know how strong it is. So I say group 1 gets 100 milligrams of coffee half an hour before the test. Group 2 gets just half of that amount the same time, half an hour before the test. And group 3 is my control group. They didn't get any coffee. And then all 3 groups get the same test. So now I have something to compare to, but this is how I manipulated the independent variable, this is the language we use in research, how I manipulated the independent variable, how I manipulated the variable coffee. And then memory is the dependent variable because this is what I measure. That means the test results from the memory test is what my numbers, what my outcome will be. And this is my dependent variable. So that's always what I measure. That's my test or whatever I employ. I could also say mating behavior of primates in captivity. So think about it. What would be the dependent variable and the independent variable now? Mating behavior of primates in captivity. If you're already confused, if you're like, I don't know I have no idea. What is the dependent or independent variable here? Again, in a 2-variable research question, you can phrase it into this phrase, the effects of on. And usually it only makes sense if it goes in one direction. So I would say the effects of captivity on mating behavior. So now it's clear. Now I have so coffee, we did that. Now I know the effects of, whatever follows effects of is my independent variable. And I said the effects of captivity, so that's my independent variable, on mating behavior, right? The other way around, it doesn't make sense. The effects of mating behavior on captivity, that doesn't make any sense. So I can manipulate captivity. So I can examine mating behavior in primates in captivity and primates that are not in captivity, that are roaming around in the jungle, right? And I can compare those two. So I could manipulate that. I can't really manipulate the mating behavior. I can just observe it. Mating behavior is now what I observe, my dependent variable. This is what I measure, and I can come up with specific ways of how I measure it. So again, if I rephrase that phrase into the effects of captivity on mating behavior, then it will become very clear. So try this one. Color perception in children with autism. What is the independent variable and what is the dependent variable in this study? Color perception in children with autism. You can pause the video for a moment, rephrase it. So can I say the effects of color perception on autism? That would be weird. No, but I can say the effects of autism on color perception. So again, autism would be my independent variable. I can manipulate it in the way that I set up a study with a group of children with autism, a group of children without autism, and then I measure color perception. I measure the dependent variable, color perception, and I will compare the results from the group of children with autism, without autism. So autism is my independent variable, or you can say diagnosis with or without autism. Color perception is what I measure. That's my dependent variable. So now let's talk about research question to hypothesis. Quickly, I mentioned that, so that we conduct a literature review, a review of scientific research up to the current date, and we make a specific prediction based in previous research. So guesses and opinions are not scientific. As a scientist, you don't just guess what the outcome is. You anchor your prediction or hypothesis in prior research. And examples are, so college students who drink 50 to 100 milligrams of coffee before a word memory recall test will remember on average more words than college students who drink no coffee before the same test. So we talked about that basic research question first, the effects. So I wonder what the effects of coffee on memory is. I do my literature review, I go into these studies, and then based on these studies, I come up with a hypothesis or prediction. And as you can see, that is very specific now, because I need to be specific of how I kind of manipulate coffee and how I define or operationalize, we'll talk about that in a minute, my dependent variable. So how will I test memory? So I will test it in form of a word memory recall test. And then I will also make a prediction as a comparison. So the people who drink coffee will remember on average more words than the students who don't drink coffee. And in this hypothesis, I already have my participant group in there. I know it's going to be an experiment with college students, etc. Usually, especially if I conduct a big experiment, I will have more than one hypothesis. I can maybe add a second hypothesis here and say, well, my second hypothesis and prediction is that female college students will on average remember more words than male college students on that test, independent of coffee, or I don't know. So I can make that as a second prediction. Again, I should anchor that in prior research. And let's talk about this operationalizing the dependent variable. I said previously, we have to be specific on how we measure the dependent variable to let people know, because sometimes it's not as clear as memory. Memory is pretty easy, but I still have to say how I will measure it. But sometimes we have more abstract constructs or big concepts and terms like happiness or success or self-esteem. And in the field of psychology, we often try to measure those big constructs. But for a study, in order to be able to conduct a study, I have to, this is a vocabulary term, I have to operationalize the dependent variable. So that means I have to define that concept or construct in a very specific terms and let people know how I will measure it. So think about it. Think about how you will measure big terms like that. So in every study, the researcher needs to operationalize this dependent variable. And in every study, the researcher needs to define the independent variable in specific terms. Like in the example before, coffee, how exactly will you manipulate coffee? So 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams, no coffee. So I create 3 groups. I have to be very specific about that as I set out to launch my study. So let's go into some examples, some fun examples. So the reason why we have to be so specific is, remember, scientific research needs to be replicable. That means another researcher at another university has to be able, after reading my study, to replicate my experiment and see if he or she comes up with the same results. Examples. So now we go into examples. So let's say we have a research question. Children are happier than adults. That's my research question. Or I can form it as a question and say, are children happier than adults? That's my research question. I wanna find out. So first of all, what's the independent variable? What's the dependent variable? All right. You can pause if you want and try to figure it out. I will tell you this is the way I would approach it if you're unclear about it. I can say the effects of age on happiness, right? That's how I could rephrase this research question. So I want to examine the effects of age on happiness. So the effects of, so age would be my independent variable that I can manipulate. That means in this case, I want to see children. I want to compare children to adults. This is how I manipulate the independent variable age. I have two groups, a group of children, a group of adults. And then what I measure, what my dependent variable is happiness, right? So happiness. So if I operationalize happiness, how can I really operationalize it? How can I measure happiness? That's what I want to know. So turn this research question into a hypothesis. In order to do this, I have to read the literature and then operationalize the dependent variable and specify the independent variable, as I just said. So how can I operationalize happiness? So let's start at the beginning, and I want you to think about some examples. I want you to pause that video in a minute. But so remember, in the field of psychology, we conduct empirical research, which means we systematically observe in order to come to some conclusions or have some outcomes in a study. So how can we observe happiness? That's what you have to think about in order to come up with some ideas of how we can measure happiness. So if you want, you can pause the video right now and think about how we can measure happiness and come up with a couple of examples. And when you're done, you can press play again, and I will give you some examples. So observations can come in many forms, and you will learn that throughout this course because we will conduct different studies and you will make different types of observations. So I can observe in research. Often in psychology, we often use behavioral observations. So how can I behaviorally observe happiness? As the researcher, I would have to think about, how do people express happiness? How do we express happiness is an emotion? It's a universal emotion. It's a very basic emotion. The way we express it naturally is by smiling, by laughing, right? So I can measure, I can define or operationalize my dependent variable by coming up with a very specific way I will measure happiness, smiles or laughter. So I would have to define it even more. I have to say, okay, smiles per minute, depending on how I set up the study, per hour, per day, but I have to be that specific in my specific study, depending on how I set it up. So that would be a behavioral observation of smiles. We also, so different scenarios, how you can set up your study. So you can say, I will have adults and children maybe play together in a room, and I will sit in an observation room and I just keep track of how many times they smile within a 15-minute period of time. I can also do video observations, which are more reliable because then I can replay it and make sure I didn't miscount. But that would be one way to do it. I can also maybe send off college students and high school students and then adults in their profession. I can send off different age groups and give them an app on their smartphone and press a button every time they smile within a day. That would be another way to do that. Of course, with younger kids, I can't rely that they really press the button on a cell phone. I would have to observe them in a different way. I can, of course, I know a lot of people, the first thing they come up with a survey. I just ask people how happy they are. Surveys, and we'll talk about survey research in this class. Survey research has its place. It has a lot of advantages. I can broadcast surveys to hundreds of thousands of people. That's great. But I have to take the results with a grain of salt because people self-report on survey. If I say, how happy are you? I don't know what people are saying. It's a very subjective feeling too. And there are a lot of pressures on surveys, internal pressures, external pressures of how people answer survey questions. So I will take it. I can do a survey in addition to my behavioral observations, but as the only measure of happiness, I wouldn't use it. But I can always combine it. I can always ask people afterwards some clever questions to kind of gauge how happy they are. And there are definitely instruments that can measure happiness. So standardized interviews or whatever that measure happiness, the level of happiness, we can use those instead of just plain surveys. So I can use these tests, psychological, psychometric tests that would be more reliable. I could also use something, an observation could be also a brain scan. If I put people in a scanner, I can, in an MRI scanner, children and adults, that's a costly way of observing. So I can't really use that on thousands of people, but I have smaller sample sizes. And there's the problem of children and even adults not being still in the scanner. But I can, in theory, I can say, okay, I'm going to give them different pictures to look at, the same pictures for the kids and the adults, and I can see how often they smile and how often in the scanner. But I really look also at, do these specific areas of the brain light up that signify happiness based on what previous MRI studies found. I want to see if these areas of the brain and the amygdala light up and how strong that signal is. And from that, I will infer how happy they are. So I'm just giving you examples to broaden your sense of what observations are in research. So again, I have to operationalize, I have to be very specific, and then I can come up with a hypothesis like this. Young children between 3 and 6 years of age will on average smile more often per day than adults. So maybe I set up a study like that based on previous research, and it's really true. On average, children smile 400 times a day, while adults only smile about 20 times a day. So if we measure happiness by the amount of smiles per day, yes, we can say children on average are happier. And there are also theories on why that is. And one of the theories is because children are able to live in the moment, right? They don't care about the past. They don't care about the future. They just are happy in the moment. So we all now preach this awareness and being back in the moment, meditating. We're all trying as adults to come up with all these different ways to be more in the moment again, because it makes us happier. All right. That's it for right now. You will have a lab where you will be able to develop a research question and turn it into a hypothesis. And our next topic will be research ethics, a really fun and very important topic also. Thanks for listening.